The afternoon of September 18, 1944. Near the village of Arracourt in eastern France, Private First Class James Henley crouched in a hedgerow, watching a Panther tank grind toward his position. The machine was terrifying. 45 tons of steel and firepower, its sloped frontal armor thick enough to shrug off hits from American tank guns. The long 75mm cannon could destroy a Sherman from 2,000 yards away. German tankers called it the Panther. American soldiers had other names for it, none of them printable. Henley was 19 years old, a rifleman with the 4th Armored Division. 3 months earlier, he had been a farm boy from Iowa who had never seen combat. Now he was holding a weapon that weighed 15 pounds, cost less to manufacture than a month of his army pay, and was supposed to be able to stop that 50-ton monster bearing down on his position. The M9A1 Bazooka, 2 pieces of steel tube that screwed together, a wire shoulder rest, a magneto trigger, simple iron sights. The whole assembly looked like it had been improvised in somebody's garage, which was not far from the truth. The shape-charge rocket it fired had been designed to punch through armor using principles of physics that most infantry men did not understand and did not need to. What they understood was this. For the first time in the war, a foot soldier armed with a weapon he could carry on his back had a fighting chance against a German tank. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Henley let the Panther come closer. 50 yards. 40. The tank's commander was buttoned up inside. Hatches closed. Vision restricted to narrow periscopes. The machine rumbled past his position, presenting its vulnerable flank. The side armor was only 40 millimeters thick in places, less than 2 inches of steel. The bazooka's rocket could penetrate 4 inches of armor plate when it hit square. Henley squeezed the trigger. The magneto sparked. The rocket motor ignited with a whoosh and a blast of flame that kicked up dirt behind him. 3.5 seconds later, the rocket slammed into the Panther's side just behind the turret. The shaped charge detonated, sending a superheated jet of metal through the armor and into the fighting compartment. The Panther shuddered to a stop. Black smoke began pouring from the engine deck. The hatches flew open and German crew members bailed out, running for cover as ammunition inside the tank began to cook off. Henley and his loader were already moving, melting back into the hedgerows before German infantry could pinpoint their position. 1 Panther destroyed, 1 bazooka team intact. A small victory in a larger battle, but it represented something revolutionary. The balance of power between infantry and armor had shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. This is the story of how that shift happened. How a simple weapon, designed in desperation and rushed into production, gave American infantry the ability to fight German tanks on more equal terms. How shape-charge technology and rocket propulsion combined to create a weapon that cost almost nothing to build but fundamentally changed infantry tactics. And how thousands of young soldiers, many of them teenagers with minimal training, learned to wield this weapon effectively in some of the most brutal combat of World War II. The story begins not on a battlefield, but in a scrap pile at an American proving ground in May 1942. Lieutenant Edward Ewell stood in the spring sunshine at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, staring at a pile of discarded metal tubing. He had a problem that needed solving, and he had exactly 0 budget and almost no time to solve it. The problem was straightforward. The United States Army needed a man-portable anti-tank weapon. Something an infantryman could carry into battle without help from a vehicle or artillery piece. Something that could stop a German panzer at ranges beyond hand grenade distance. What the Army had was the M10 shape-charge grenade. It packed enough explosive punch to penetrate 60 millimeters of armor, enough to damage or destroy any tank then in service. But the M10 weighed 3.5 pounds. Far too heavy to throw effectively. Too heavy even to launch from a rifle-mounted grenade launcher. The only practical way to use it was for a soldier to run up to an enemy tank and place it directly on the armor. A suicidal delivery method in any realistic combat scenario. Ewell had been tasked by Captain Leslie Skinner to find a delivery system. Something that could get that shape-charge warhead onto a tank from a safe distance with enough velocity to make the charge work properly. Rocket propulsion seemed like the obvious answer. Dr. Robert Goddard had experimented with small rocket launchers as far back as 1918, developing a prototype that could fire a rocket-propelled explosive projectile. But World War I had ended before the weapon could be tested in combat, and the project had been abandoned. Now, 24 years later, the idea was being reconsidered. Ewell had built a small rocket to carry the grenade body. The rocket motor worked. The shaped charge worked. What he needed was a launch tube, something to protect the firer from the rocket exhaust, something to aim with, something simple enough to manufacture quickly and cheaply. That was when he saw the tube in the scrap pile. It was about 60 millimeters in diameter, a piece of steel tubing that had been discarded from some other project. Ewell picked it up. It was exactly the right size for the rocket he had built. He could see the whole system in his mind instantly. Put the tube on a soldier's shoulder. Load the rocket from the rear. Fire it electrically. The exhaust would vent harmlessly behind the firer. The tube would provide a crude but effective aiming device. According to Ewell's own account years later, I was walking by this scrap pile, and there was a tube that happened to be the same size as the grenade that we were turning into a rocket. I said, "That is the answer. Put the tube on a soldier's shoulder with the rocket inside, and away it goes." Within days, Ewell and Skinner had assembled a working prototype. A simple steel tube with a wooden shoulder rest. A battery-powered electrical firing system. Basic iron sights. The entire assembly weighed about 13 pounds unloaded. It looked crude because it was crude, but it worked. The weapon was scheduled to be demonstrated at a competitive trial of various types of spigot mortars at Aberdeen Proving Ground in May 1942. The trial was meant to evaluate different methods of delivering shaped charge warheads against armored targets. Various systems would be tested. The one that performed best would be recommended for production. On the morning of the trial, Ewell and Skinner realized they had forgotten one critical detail. Their launcher had no sights, nothing to aim with, nothing to help a soldier gauge distance or compensate for trajectory. They improvised. Using a wire coat hanger, they bent some crude sights and attached them to the tube with whatever fasteners they could find. The front sight was positioned at the muzzle, the rear sight at the shoulder end. Graduations were scratched into the metal for ranges of 100, 200, 300, and 400 yards. Then they took their improvised weapon to the proving ground and waited their turn. The trial was observed by senior officers from Army Ordnance, including Major General Gladion M. Barnes, Chief of Research and Engineering in the Ordnance Department. The officers were there to watch spigot mortars, sophisticated weapons that had been carefully engineered and properly tested. They were not particularly interested in what appeared to be a homemade rocket launcher assembled from scrap parts. Then the shooting started. The spigot mortars fired, and fired again, and missed. The target was a moving tank, driving across the range at combat speeds. The mortars could not hit it. The trajectories were wrong. The timing was off. The systems were too complicated. Ewell loaded his launcher, shouldered it, aimed using the coat hanger sights, fired. The rocket streaked across the range and slammed into the moving tank. Direct hit. He loaded again, fired again. Another hit. The spigot mortars achieved 0 hits on the moving target. The improvised rocket launcher, built from scrap parts with sights made from a coat hanger, scored multiple direct hits. General Barnes watched in astonishment. Then he grabbed the launcher and fired it himself. Another hit. He lowered the weapon and looked at it carefully. Then he reportedly said, "It sure looks like Bob Burns' bazooka." Bob Burns was a popular radio comedian of the era. His signature prop was a musical instrument he called a bazooka, a homemade contraption made from stovepipes and a whiskey funnel that made ridiculous noises. The rocket launcher, with its long tube and crude construction, bore a vague resemblance to Burns' musical instrument. The name stuck. Nobody would ever call it the Launcher Rocket 2.36-inch anti-tank M1. It was the bazooka, and within hours of that demonstration, it was headed for mass production. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, was briefed on the test results. He watched a demonstration personally. Then he did something almost unprecedented. He ordered 5,000 units on the spot. No prolonged testing. No evaluation period. No competitive bidding. Just build 5,000 bazookas immediately and get them to troops in the field. The contract went to General Electric. By late 1942, the first production models were rolling off assembly lines. The design had been refined slightly. Proper sights had been added. The electrical system had been improved. But the basic concept remained unchanged. A simple steel tube, a shape-charge rocket, a shoulder-fired delivery system that any infantryman could learn to operate. The cost was astonishingly low. While exact production costs are difficult to verify from surviving records, the bazooka was among the cheapest weapon systems produced during the war. The launcher itself required minimal machining, no complex parts, no precision manufacturing. Steel tubing, some wood for the shoulder stock, basic electrical components for the firing system. The rockets were more complex, but still far cheaper than artillery shells or tank rounds of comparable effectiveness. What made the bazooka revolutionary was not its sophistication but its simplicity. It democratized anti-tank warfare. Before the bazooka, stopping a tank required a bigger tank, a towed anti-tank gun, or suicidal courage with a satchel charge. After the bazooka, any two-man infantry team could engage armor at ranges up to 300 yards with a reasonable chance of success. But there was a problem that would become apparent almost immediately. The weapon had been designed and built so quickly that there had been no time to train troops in its use. No doctrine had been developed. No tactics had been worked out. The first bazookas shipped to combat units arrived with almost no supporting materials. Just the weapon, the ammunition, and soldiers who had never seen anything like it before. The bazooka made its combat debut in November 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. 600 M1 bazookas were hastily shipped to Egypt and distributed to American and British forces landing in Algeria and Morocco. The night before the landings, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was shocked to learn from a subordinate that none of his troops had received any instruction in the use of the bazooka. The weapons had simply been issued with no training, no manuals, no guidance whatsoever. Soldiers were expected to figure them out on their own under combat conditions. The results were predictably chaotic. The early M6 rockets were notoriously unreliable. They misfired. They failed to detonate. The electrical firing system had problems in damp conditions. Batteries died at inopportune moments. Soldiers who did manage to fire the weapon discovered that the backblast was far more dramatic than they had expected, kicking up dust and debris that revealed their position to every enemy soldier within 500 yards. By May 1943, not a single confirmed report of a bazooka actually stopping a tank had been received by Army ordnance. The weapon was suspended from combat use while engineers scrambled to fix its problems. The M9A1 launcher was introduced in July 1943 with an improved electrical system and simplified design. More importantly, the ammunition was completely redesigned. The new M6A1 rocket was far more reliable than its predecessor. It worked in cold weather. It worked in damp conditions. It detonated when it was supposed to. Soldiers began to gain confidence in the weapon. Training programs were established. Doctrine was developed. Two-man bazooka teams became a standard part of infantry organization. A gunner who aimed and fired. A loader who carried the rockets and loaded from the rear of the tube. The effective range was about 100 meters, though the rocket could travel much farther. The shape-charge warhead, using high-explosive anti-tank principles, could penetrate up to 4 inches of armor plate when it struck at the proper angle. This was enough to defeat the side and rear armor of any German tank then in service, including the dreaded Panther. But the Panther presented a special problem. When it appeared on the battlefield in July 1943 during the Battle of Kursk on the Eastern Front, Allied intelligence immediately recognized it as a game-changer. The Panther's frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick on the glassy plate, sloped at 55 degrees from vertical. Effective thickness was nearly double that figure. No infantry anti-tank weapon could penetrate it frontally. The sides were a different story. Panther side armor was only 40 to 50 millimeters thick in most places, designed primarily to protect against Soviet anti-tank rifles and machine gun fire. A bazooka rocket striking the side of a Panther could penetrate easily, especially if it hit at a 90-degree angle. The challenge was getting that side shot. Panthers were designed to be used in combined arms operations, with infantry and other tanks protecting their vulnerable flanks. A well-commanded Panther would never expose its sides to infantry at close range if the crew could help it. But in the confused fighting of the Normandy hedgerows and the forests of eastern France, Panthers frequently found themselves isolated, cut off from supporting infantry, forced to operate in terrain that negated their advantages in long-range firepower and frontal protection. This was when bazooka teams could be most effective, waiting in ambush, letting the Panther pass, then hitting it from the side or rear where the armor was weakest. The psychological impact worked both ways. American infantrymen gained confidence knowing they had a weapon that could at least threaten German armor. They were no longer completely helpless when a tank appeared. German tank crews became more cautious, more aware of their vulnerability to close-range infantry attack. The Germans were so impressed by captured bazookas that they immediately copied the design, creating the Panzerschreck, an 88mm rocket launcher that used the same basic principles but with a larger warhead. The fact that the Germans felt compelled to copy an American infantry weapon was itself a kind of victory. By late 1943, the M9 Bazooka was entering production. This was the version that would see the most widespread use for the remainder of the war. It could be broken down into two sections for easier transport, making it ideal for airborne troops. The wooden furniture was replaced with metal to reduce cost and simplify production. A magneto-based trigger system replaced the troublesome battery ignition. Most importantly, it fired the improved M6A3 rocket, which could penetrate up to 125 millimeters of armor. Still not enough to defeat a Panther frontally, but more than adequate for side and rear shots. Production ramped up dramatically. General Electric in Bridgeport, Connecticut, along with other contractors, manufactured hundreds of thousands of launchers. By the end of the war, nearly 500,000 bazookas of all types had been built, along with more than 15 million rockets. The training challenge was enormous. Tens of thousands of soldiers needed to learn how to operate the weapon effectively, how to load it safely, how to aim accounting for the rocket's trajectory, how to fire without exposing yourself to enemy observation, how to work as a two-man team with your loader, how to identify vulnerable points on enemy armor, how to pick ambush positions, how to escape after firing. The Army developed specialized training programs at bases across the United States. Soldiers practiced on firing ranges using inert rockets. They studied silhouettes of German tanks, learning to recognize Panthers, Tigers, Mark IVs, assault guns. They learned to estimate ranges by eye. They practiced loading and firing until the movements became automatic. The exact duration of bazooka training varied by unit and circumstances. Some soldiers received extensive instruction over several weeks. Others got hasty, compressed training measured in days or even hours before being shipped to combat zones. The weapon's simplicity meant that basic proficiency could be achieved relatively quickly. A motivated soldier could learn the fundamentals in a matter of hours. Becoming truly skilled took longer, and that often happened in combat rather than on a training range. What the training emphasized above all was patience and discipline. Do not fire at the frontal armor of heavy tanks. Wait for the side shot. Let the tank get close. Make the first shot count because the backblast would reveal your position and you might not get a second chance. These lessons were reinforced by hard experience in combat. The bazooka was not a miracle weapon. Could not stop every tank from every angle. It required courage to use effectively because engaging armor at close range meant putting yourself within range of the tank's machine guns and main armament. But it gave infantry a fighting chance they had never had before. And in the brutal close-quarters fighting of northwestern Europe in 1944 and 1945, that chance made all the difference. By the autumn of 1944, American infantry divisions advancing across France and into Germany carried bazookas as standard equipment. Every rifle company had multiple two-man teams trained in anti-tank tactics. The weapon had evolved from an experimental novelty into an essential part of the infantry arsenal. The Battle of Arracourt in September 1944 demonstrated what bazookas could accomplish when used properly. The 4th Armored Division, part of General George Patton's Third Army, clashed with German forces that included newly formed panzer brigades equipped with Panther tanks. Over the course of 11 days of fighting, the Germans committed 262 tanks to the battle. They suffered catastrophic losses. American M4 Sherman tanks destroyed many Panthers, but bazooka teams accounted for a significant number of kills as well. The terrain favored the defenders. Rolling hills, scattered villages, patches of forest. Panthers advancing across open ground or through narrow village streets found themselves ambushed by infantry teams that had positioned themselves carefully, waited patiently, and fired only when they had clear shots at vulnerable side and rear armor. One after-action report described a bazooka team from the 35th Infantry Division that destroyed 3 Panthers in a single engagement. The team had concealed themselves in a roadside ditch as a column of German armor approached. They let the first 2 Panthers pass, then fired at the 3rd tank from behind, hitting the engine compartment. The rocket penetrated the thin rear armor and started a fire. As the crew bailed out, the team reloaded and engaged the 2nd Panther, which had stopped and was attempting to reverse. Another hit, another kill. The 1st Panther, realizing what was happening, tried to traverse its turret to engage the infantry, but the team had already displaced to a secondary position. They fired from a different angle, striking the Panther's side. 3 tanks destroyed in less than 5 minutes. Stories like this spread through American units, building confidence and refining tactics. Soldiers learned that the key to bazooka success was not firepower but positioning. Get close. Stay concealed. Wait for the right shot. Fire and move immediately. German tank commanders adapted as well. They became more cautious about advancing without infantry support. They added improvised armor to their tanks, welding spare track links onto vulnerable areas or hanging steel skirts called Schürzen along the sides. These modifications offered some protection, but they also added weight, strained already problematic transmissions, and reduced the Panther's mobility advantage. The psychological warfare worked both ways. American soldiers who knew they carried bazookas felt less helpless when armor appeared. German tank crews, aware that any patch of brush or pile of rubble might conceal a bazooka team, became more hesitant, more defensive. This hesitation degraded German armor effectiveness even when bazookas were not actually present. The bazooka's impact extended beyond direct kills. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, bazookas played a crucial role in slowing German armored advances. At Saint-Vith, Bastogne, and dozens of smaller engagements, American infantry teams engaged German tanks in desperate close-range fighting. The conditions were brutal. Frozen ground, snow-covered terrain, bitter cold that made the bazooka's magneto-firing system temperamental. Soldiers discovered that rockets stored in extreme cold sometimes failed to ignite properly. Batteries for backup electrical systems died in the freezing temperatures. Crews had to keep rockets warm inside their uniforms, an uncomfortable but necessary adaptation. Despite these challenges, bazookas accounted for numerous German tanks during the Ardennes offensive. At Chinon, a single bazooka team reportedly destroyed a Tiger tank, one of the war's most heavily armored vehicles. The team caught the Tiger moving through a narrow road between buildings, firing at the engine deck from an elevated position. The rocket penetrated the thin top armor, causing a catastrophic ammunition fire. Such kills were exceptional, almost miraculous. Tigers had armor up to 180 millimeters thick on the front. But even Tigers had vulnerable points. Engine decks, side armor, the rear plate. A skilled bazooka team that could maneuver into position and deliver a shot at one of these weak spots could achieve results that seemed impossible on paper. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The limitations of the bazooka became more apparent as the war progressed and German armor continued to improve. By early 1945, even the improved M9A1 with its M6A3 rocket struggled against the newest German tanks. The Tiger II, known to the Allies as the King Tiger, had frontal armor exceeding 150 millimeters. The Jag Tiger tank destroyer boasted armor up to 250 millimeters thick. Against such monsters, the 2.36-inch bazooka was nearly useless except for the most precise shots at the most vulnerable points. American forces in Germany in 1945 increasingly relied on their own tanks, tank destroyers, and towed anti-tank guns to deal with heavy German armor. Work had begun as early as 1943 on a larger, more powerful bazooka. The 3.5-inch Super Bazooka fired an 88mm rocket capable of penetrating up to 11 inches of armor. But development moved slowly, and the weapon was not standardized until October 1945, after Germany had already surrendered. The Super Bazooka would not see combat until the Korean War, where it proved devastatingly effective against Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks. In a bitter irony, the weapon that might have been more useful against German heavy armor in World War II arrived too late for that conflict but just in time for the next one. The original bazooka's legacy extended far beyond its combat record. It pioneered the concept of man-portable guided anti-tank weapons that would dominate infantry arsenals for decades to come. The Soviet RPG series, still in widespread use today, traces its lineage directly back to the bazooka concept. Modern weapons like the AT-4 and Javelin missile represent the evolution of principles first demonstrated on that scrap pile at Aberdeen Proving Ground in May 1942. More importantly, the bazooka changed how armies thought about infantry and armor. Before World War II, tanks were seen as nearly invulnerable to infantry attack. After the bazooka, tank commanders had to account for the threat of infantry anti-tank weapons in every tactical decision. Armor could no longer operate independently of supporting infantry. Closed terrain became more dangerous. Urban warfare, where tanks were vulnerable to attack from multiple angles, became especially hazardous. The German response to captured bazookas validated American ingenuity. When Wehrmacht forces recovered bazookas from battlefields in Tunisia in early 1943, German engineers immediately recognized the weapon's potential. Within months, they had developed the Panzerschreck, essentially an enlarged bazooka firing an 88mm rocket. The Germans also developed the Panzerfaust, a disposable single-shot anti-tank weapon based on similar principles. The fact that Germany, with its vaunted engineering tradition, chose to copy a hastily designed American weapon speaks volumes about the bazooka's fundamental soundness. The basic concept was so effective that it needed no improvement, only scaling up. For American soldiers, the bazooka represented something more than just a weapon. It symbolized American industrial and engineering creativity. The ability to take a simple idea, refine it quickly, manufacture it cheaply, and distribute it widely. The bazooka was not elegant. It was not sophisticated. But it worked. It was reliable enough once the early problems were fixed, and there were enough of them to equip every unit that needed anti-tank capability. The soldiers who carried bazookas into combat were often very young. Many were teenagers, 18 or 19 years old, fresh from training camps in the United States. They learned to use the weapon not through lengthy courses but through necessity, practice, and the guidance of more experienced soldiers. The simplicity of the design meant that even young, relatively inexperienced troops could become proficient quickly. This democratization of anti-tank warfare had profound implications. In previous wars, defeating enemy armor required specialized units with expensive equipment and extensive training. The bazooka put that capability in the hands of ordinary infantrymen. A rifle squad on patrol could engage tanks if necessary. A forward observer team could defend itself against armored attack. Rear area troops had protection against breakthrough raids by enemy armor. The bazooka was never a tank killer in the same sense as a towed anti-tank gun or a tank destroyer. This penetration was limited. This range was short. It required courage and skill to use effectively. But it filled a critical gap in infantry capabilities, and it did so at minimal cost and with minimal training requirements. By the war's end, American forces had produced 476,000 bazookas of all types and more than 15 million rockets. These weapons served not only American forces but also British, French, and Soviet allied armies through Lend-Lease programs. The bazooka became as much a symbol of American military power as the Sherman tank or the B-17 bomber. The title claim that a $50 weapon could turn infantry into Panther killers in 72 hours of training contains elements of truth wrapped in understandable exaggeration. The bazooka was indeed cheap to produce, though exact cost figures are difficult to verify from surviving records. Training could be accomplished quickly for basic proficiency, though mastery took longer. and properly employed against vulnerable points, bazookas could and did destroy Panther tanks. But the real story is more nuanced and more impressive than any simplified claim. The bazooka represented a fundamental shift in infantry anti-tank doctrine. It gave soldiers options they had never possessed before. It forced tank designers to account for threats from unexpected angles. It demonstrated that simple, cheaply produced weapons could have strategic impact if they were designed intelligently and deployed effectively. The soldiers who carried bazookas into battle deserve recognition not for wielding a miracle weapon but for using a simple tool with skill and courage under terrible conditions. The engineers who designed the bazooka deserve credit not for creating something sophisticated but for recognizing that sophistication was not required. Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one. And the next time you see footage of American infantry in World War II carrying those distinctive tubes over their shoulders, remember what they represented. Not just a weapon, but a symbol of American pragmatism. The willingness to try unconventional solutions. The ability to move from concept to production in months rather than years. The industrial capacity to manufacture hundreds of thousands of units. And the courage of young soldiers who learned to get close to enemy tanks armed with nothing but a tube, a rocket, and determination. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.